today. We are about to hear from the Chief of Navy, who has received the interim report into the grounding and sinking of HMNZS Manawanui last month. I want to acknowledge the work that has gone on to get us to this point in terms of piecing together the different aspects of what occurred. Gathering evidence and the facts of what happened is an important job, and I'm very pleased with the speed and level of detail at which the Defence Force has been able to produce this interim report. It goes to the heart of what occurred on the day. I would also like to thank the Samoan government for their assistance in working together as part of the response to the grounding and sinking of the ship. It is also important for me to take this time to reiterate my support for our people out there on the front line who work so hard every day to protect New Zealand and New Zealanders. While no one can predict these types of scenarios, I am so very grateful and thankful that everyone on board returns safely and that environmental impacts have been able to be kept to a minimum. I will now hand over to Chief of Navy, Rear Admiral Golding, to talk you through the Court of Inquiry's initial findings.
Kia ora koutou, and thank you for joining us today. Today I'm going to announce what the Court of Inquiry has found happened in relation to the grounding and sinking of HMNZS Manawanui. The direct cause of the grounding has been determined as a series of human errors, which meant the ship's autopilot was not disengaged when it should have been. The crew was not aware that Manawanui remained in autopilot, and as a consequence, mistakenly assessed the ship's failure to respond to directional changes to the thruster controls as a thruster control failure. Having mistakenly assessed a thruster control failure, standard procedures should have prompted the ship's crew to check that the ship was in manual control rather than autopilot. This check did not occur. Remaining in autopilot resulted in the ship maintaining a course of 340 degrees towards land until grounding and eventually stranding. The purpose of this interim report was to establish what occurred, why it happened, and the what next in terms of lessons learned are still being worked on as part of a wider Court of Inquiry that will be completed in the first quarter of next year. Because of this, I may not be able to answer all of the questions you might have today, but I think it's important that we are as transparent as possible about what we know at this point in time. I will now talk through the overview of what the Court of Inquiry has found to have occurred. Evidence has been collected through the interviews with the crew and data from the ship's recordings. On Saturday, the 5th of October, 2024, HMNZS Manawanui was conducting survey operations on the southern side of Apia, Samoa. The weather at the time was a strong breeze of up to 25 knots and there was a moderate swell. The survey was conducted in a box-shaped area running west to east in survey lanes that start on the outside moving towards the reef. At about 6:15 p.m, Manawanui was conducting final runs of the inward box around half a nautical mile south of the Sinalei Reef, travelling at approximately 6 knots. The ship's crew attempted a routine turn to starboard to the right, initially to a course of 340 degrees within the survey area as part of a turn. The crew attempted to turn off the 340 degree course to the right, towards an easterly course, but the ship did not respond as intended. Shortly after, Manawanui left the approved survey area, and in an effort to stop the ship, the crew conducted further actions that they believed should have resulted in the ship essentially stopping. Manawanui did not slow or stop, and instead accelerated towards the reef, grounding for the first time at or about 6:17 p.m. at a speed of more than 10 knots. The ship then travelled around 400 yards before becoming stranded grounding multiple times along the way. Full control of Manawanui's propulsion system was not regained until 10 minutes later at 6:27 p.m. when the ship's autopilot was disengaged. The inability to turn and stop the ship is attributed to the ship being in autopilot mode. Unsuccessful attempts were then made to manoeuvre the ship off the reef. Manawanui was brought to emergency stations after the grounding, and searches were conducted to check for damage. No damage or flooding was detected inside the ship. However, stability assessments made after the grounding indicated Manawanui was no longer stable. The ship's angle of list, its lean to the side, was approaching the limits for safe abandonment, and at approximately 6:46 p.m, around 30 minutes after the initial grounding, the decision was made to abandon ship. The timeliness of the decision to abandon ship and to keep the Manawanui's generators running contributed to the successful abandonment process and in all likelihood prevented serious injury or worse from occurring. At some point after the abandonment, the ship suffered a series of catastrophic fires before capsizing and sinking. The abandonment process and subsequent events will be covered in greater detail during Phase 2 of the Court of Inquiry. Because the Court has identified human error as the cause of the incident, a separate disciplinary process outside of the Court of Inquiry will need to be initiated. A separate disciplinary investigation will commence upon the conclusion of the Court of Inquiry, which is expected to be completed at the end of February. As well as the primary cause, there are also a number of identified contributing factors which made the ship's grounding more likely. These included areas around training, planning, supervision, readiness and risk assessments. These factors will be explored in more detail during Phase 2 of the Court of Inquiry. However, to provide some immediate assurance, we have conducted a series of audits in the fleet and looked to make improvements where these initial lessons from the interim report have been identified. At this point, I'd like to thank the Transport Accident Investigation Commission, the Royal Australian Navy, the Royal New Zealand Air Force for their contributions and support to the Court of Inquiry investigation. I want to reassure the public of New Zealand and Samoa that we will own it, fix it and learn from it. And I know it's on me as the Chief of Navy to earn back your trust. We have incredible people in the Defence Force who answer the call to serve every day. Much of their work is risky and decisions can be a matter of life or death. Nobody shows up to work to have a bad day. In this situation, we thankfully did not lose any lives. However, lives have been affected, and we will continue to support and work closely with those that were on Manawanui that day. Our priority is to continue to support the Samoan government with the response to this incident. I will now take questions acknowledging my earlier point where we are at with the investigation and the need to allow proper process to take place. This means I may not be able to answer all of your questions.
What do you think that this does for New Zealand's reputation on the world stage?
Well, obviously, this has had an impact to our reputation. That's where I said earlier that we need to own it, we need to fix it and learn the lessons. But at the same time that Manawanui incident occurred, we provided successful support to Samoa for CHOGM with Canterbury and Matatoa. We've had Aotearoa deploy to Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, and they just returned. And now they're out at sea today, preparing to go down to the Antarctic in support of Antarctic New Zealand. And we've got Te Kaha off the coast of Australia preparing for their mission to the Middle East next year. So we're out there doing things on behalf of our nation.
Can you categorically tell me that there is no fuel or oil or diesel currently coming out of that ship?
We've been very consistent in saying that there is a persistent slow leak coming from Manawanui, and we monitor it each day with our divers that are in place in Samoa.
What processes are you putting in place for compensation? The villagers and the chiefs are all demanding it.
Yeah, the compensation side is a matter for the Samoan government, and we are supporting the Samoan government in that process.
Under standard protocol, how many people were responsible for checking if it was an autopilot?
On the bridge at the time, the main person, so I can probably help you run through that. So the autopilot, the person in charge or in control of the ship, would sit in a seat with the two thrusters that can operate the ship in manual. The autopilot is this panel here, so the officer in control of the ship at any stage could check on this panel whether the ship was an autopilot or not. Additionally, on the bridge was a supervisor who, at the time there was confusion, could have provided assistance at this stage.
And in this disciplinary process, how many people could be implicated?
At this stage, the disciplinary investigation, which will conclude on completion, will at this stage look at the officer who was in control of the ship, the officer that was supervising that person, and the commanding officer of the ship.
And was any of the crew aware that the grounding may have been a cause of human error?
I'm not unsure whether the crew is, but they would be privy to, as part of the investigation, has been undertaking interviews, etc. So.
And have you been reached out to Samoan government authorities, and what's their response been?
So we have provided a copy of this brief to our senior national representative, Commodore Andrew Brown, and he has already done some pre-briefing to the Samoan government and the High Commission in preparation for this announcement.
What was the Manawanui doing here in the first place, and did the Samoan government give authority for the ship to be in Samoa?
The ship was responding to a task in support of the Commonwealth heads of government to conduct a survey to the southern part of the island in support of that event.
Is weather and conditions one of the things that's going to be looked at as to whether the Manawanui should have been operating there at that particular time?
So they'd been conducting the survey for 22 hours. That's how long the survey. They were in their final parts of that survey, and as always, we'll continue to look at all factors that relate to the incident, but at this stage, human factors determine the cause of the grounding.
Minister, if I may ask you, just what was your reaction to this news?
Well, I think we're all terribly disappointed about what happened and why it happened. We're taking this obviously, Navy's taking this very seriously, but I would say that Navy said that they would come forward and let the public know about the interim results. They have. They've acted in a professional manner, and I think that New Zealanders can know that it was a terrible day. Fortunately, it wasn't it wasn't a tragic day as in lives were not lost, but they can also have full confidence that the Navy and the Defence Force is not shying away from this. They've stepped up to the mark, and they're taking the responsibility extremely seriously. So I always say to people, terrible situations are going to occur. It's actually how you handle those that makes a difference as to whether or not people can have full confidence in you. And that's where I think the Navy has absolutely fronted up. So, yeah, it was extremely disappointing, but that's clearly what's happened.
And I guess, how do you see this affects our relationship with Samoa?
Oh, look, I think that Samoa is very aware that we have had the Navy there assisting Samoa through the Chogam situation, that we have been fortunate to date to not have large oil spills or anything like that. It's diesel we're mostly talking about. It's on the other side of the reef away from land, but also that the salvage process is moving through, and I know that Commodore Andrew Brown, who's the Deputy Chief of Navy, who's been based in Samoa for quite some time. He and his team have been keeping the Samoan government and our High Commission highly informed of it. So I think there's a lot of trust, as there should be, between Samoa and New Zealand, and the Samoan government have been absolutely great, standing up, helping wherever they've been asked, but also we've had help from, as the Chief of Navy has said, from others as well, so they can have full confidence that we're doing everything we can.
Minister, locals in Samoa were not happy about a comment you made on Q&A with Jack Tame about it being a trickle. What's your response to that?
Well, I'm working off the video that I saw, and that was pretty clearly a trickle. It was moving out to sea, and it was diesel, not oil, so quite clearly that was it. I know that the Navy had people looking at the flotsam that they'd been presented with, and it turned out it was actually vegetation and other things from land, so it wasn't from the ship. Look, there could be other things, but the big thing from my point of view is to get that job done, to get the diesel out, and you might be able to give some idea to the public about when that's going to be done.
My understanding is that the barge that has all the salvage equipment is to depart today. I haven't got confirmation whether it departed, and if all going well, weather dependent, that those salvage operations will commence week commencing 16th of December is the current planning.
And you realise we're trying to get this all done before the cyclone season to make sure that we don't get a lot more than what we have been. Yeah.
And you've made some changes to training protocols as a result of this. Can you tell us what some of those changes are?
Yeah, sure. Some of the assurance that we've done is all vessels in our fleet have a similar functionality for an autopilot, so that if you are doing directional changes and manually when the ship is in autopilot, it won't adjust. But if you're doing acceleration or deceleration in autopilot, it will take those orders, and it's just a matter of making sure that those out in the fleet understand the importance of being aware whether you're in autopilot or not. One of the other big areas that we really need to get after is our risk assessment and management procedures, and so that's something that we're actively looking at. And then just the importance, the last one, just the importance of the voyage data that we got from Manawanui, is to make sure that everybody in the fleet understands the importance of that, and if they were in an incident, to make sure it's saved.
How has this outcome affected insurance?
We continue to insure our ships as we have before, and
which is not for replacement, but
yes,
it's for the salvage.
And the fact that it's human error, has that affected insurance or not at all?
Not to my knowledge.
I wouldn't have thought so, but I mean,
Do you think you would see, a bit of an overhaul of policies or training schedules as a result of what comes out of this? I
think it's important for us, as I said earlier, is that important that we own it. There are mistakes, there are errors in our system, and we need to fix those and learn from it. So as the Court of Inquiry progresses, as we start to understand now that we know what happened, we need to understand why and the contributing factors, and then once we do some deep analysis and assessment, is that we start getting after them. But one of the, a couple of the key areas that I spoke about is around risk assessment and management, and our orders, instructions and procedures need to be improved.
Are there no procedures to cross-check?
Yes, we have procedures to cross-check.
So then, if it was human error, why didn't someone cross-check if they thought it was the autopilot?
So that's the point, is that if someone made a mistake, there are other people, the supervisor on the bridge has the knowledge to say, do we check the autopilot in that regards. And we have, as part of our generation of our ships, we have an independent team that goes on board and they run the ship through rehearsals of different events, fires, floods, etc. And part of that process, they assess whether a ship is ready to deploy or not, and we go through that process. But on the day, muscle memory from the person in control should have leant over to that panel and checked whether the screen said autopilot or not. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a human error. We are humans, we make mistakes, and nobody shows up on the day to have a bad day.
Could it be possible then that they were fatigued?
We're part of the next stage is to look into the why. So we're talking about the what happened today, and then the why is equally important. And that's why we wanted to get something out so quickly to be transparent about what happened. But the important part comes in the next phase, that we understand the why, what their lessons are, and we really need to fix it and improve from it.
And do you know their movements between the moment that they found they couldn't steer and were heading towards land, they were effectively trying to brake? I guess, could you just point us through their movements there?
Sure. So the ship was running along in an easterly movement. We, from the Court of Inquiry, has assessed that this turn was conducted in manual control. So the person in control was sitting in a seat with their left hand on that thruster and their right hand on that thruster, and had turned it into the direction so the ship can conduct that turn. The ship then proceeded along to the west, and at this stage the ship was engaged in autopilot, which required the perspex lid to be lifted and the switch to be set into autopilot, which showed up on that panel. This turn, the Court of Inquiry has determined, was conducted in autopilot using that panel. The ship then proceeded along with the intent to turn back to the east along here to fill a holiday, or in surveying terms, or to fill a gap in the survey data. The ship was attempted to be turned in manual using thrusters. But as I mentioned before, when you're in autopilot, you can, if you attempt to do it in a directional change and you're in autopilot, it won't change direction. So the ship continued along this course 340. At that stage, the officer in control incorrectly assessed that it was a thruster issue. In the procedures, that would require that person to check whether the ship is in autopilot or not. That check was not conducted. They then attempted to slow the ship down in their mind by turning these towards astern or backwards, so that when they put the power on to thrust, it would, in their mind, make the ship go backwards. But in effect, it forced the ship sped up and accelerated towards the reef, because when you're in autopilot, any adjustment of speed is accepted within the autopilot system. And then the ship hit the reef and stranded in that position and is now located in that position.
And can you tell us who was in command at the time and who else was on the bridge?
Yes, so as I mentioned before, there is a person that's on who's in control of the ship.
Could you name that person?
No, I'm not naming that person. I'm saying that the person that was in that position was in control of the ship. There was another person, because of the location being close to the reef, was supervising that individual. And they had other people that were part of the surveying team that were on the bridge.
Minister, have you briefed, and I know you must have, so what was the response, the reaction from Cabinet, the Prime Minister?
Well, the matter hasn't yet been to Cabinet, because people can see this is only just coming out today, and Cabinet's on Monday. We are all, I've said, it's pretty came early indications that there might be human error involved. I think nobody is happy about this. This is not at all a good result, but as I've said, complaining about it's not going to make it better. The main thing is we get on, we sort out all of the lessons from this, we don't allow this to happen again. But worse than that, this is really knocked Navy for six. Personnel are obviously extremely upset about this, and as you rightly, you're just, I think, as shocked as we all are. And but I don't think anyone can fault Navy standing up and saying this is what happened and we own it, we're going to fix it as much as we can.
For the livelihoods of the villagers in Samoa, do they have to wait until February to be able to fish within the area?
Look, it's outside of our area as our area as the Navy, and also me as Minister of Defence, around the livelihoods of the Samoan villagers. I know that Commodore Brown has been immensely involved with the villagers of Samoa, and I think it would be quite remiss of me to try and wade in there, but obviously these are matters that the Prime Minister has also discussed with the Prime Minister of Samoa. It's simply not something that I can get involved with.
And how do you think this, I guess, reflects on us on the world stage, and what would your message be to some of our allies that would like to, I guess, be nervous about maybe using our defence capabilities?
Well, as you know, we've had this sort of thing happen in the civilian world with ferries. We've had one just recently about the same time with the autopilot and people not working out what to do. I think what it says is that we are not a country that is going to shy away from the truth. The fact is Navy has been under severe stress with attrition rates up to 17.7%. They're now right down to about 7.2. So we've lost a lot of good people, a lot of good experience, but at the same time there's no reason for me to jump to a conclusion that that has anything to do with this. But what it is that things do go wrong. They go wrong in situations where people's lives are put at risk. People's lives were quite clearly put at risk in this situation. And I'm talking about 70-odd people could have been dead. But one thing worked, and that was getting people off the ship at the right time. If they'd waited much longer with that list, I don't think we'd be having this conversation. So, look, things do happen, and every military in the world that operates any equipment will tell you that human error is the one thing you can't guarantee against, but it's certainly one thing we can all learn from. And I don't think there's anyone in New Zealand's Royal New Zealand Navy who isn't very aware of this situation.
And I've engaged the Chief of Navies of our partner nations, and they've passed on their best wishes, but they understand that it's an inherently dangerous job that we do in the military, and they are thankful for the contributions that we make in support of them on the world stage. And I mentioned some of those contributions that we're making and will make earlier.
And there's certainly been no pushback on all of the operations, deployments that our Navy are undertaking. And in fact, there's more call for our Navy in many ways than there has been for a very long time.
And then just one more technical question. Were all 5 thrusters operational at the time of the gun?
That will be part of the phase 2 of the investigation.
Minister, you mentioned earlier in your briefing that Samoa was briefed on the reports. What was your response?
Well, not by me. I'm sure. I think Andrew.
Yeah, so Commodore Andrew Brown, who is in country, briefed prior to this, so I've been tied up in preparation, so I'm unaware of the outcome of that.
This report comes off the back of 6 cases of whooping cough in Samoa, as well as a fire that happened at the Salilonga Wharf. Is New Zealand going to help at all with the fire?
I'm sure you're not suggesting that the Navy's got anything to do with either of those events.
I'm just asking if New Zealand
I'm sure you are not suggesting that, right? So that would obviously be a matter for the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Prime Minister, but clearly New Zealand has always assisted whenever we've been asked for from Samoa, and we have a very long history that we are very close with Samoa and the Samoan government. So, I don't think it's appropriate for the Navy to be asked about that. Thank you.
Lastly, sorry, you mentioned in your Q&A with Jack Tame that by the end of this you'd be an oil expert. Do you think you're
expert?
An oil expert.
Did I say that?
Yeah. Do you think you're an oil expert now, Minister?
Well, I think I was more of an oil expert when I was the Minister for Energy and Resources, because now we're mostly talking about diesel. But yeah, look, I tell you, it's you start to get a little bit of an expert in dealing with situations of things that can go wrong, and sometimes it's one of those days where anything does go wrong. And as I said, at least nobody died or was seriously injured. Thank you for your questions.